Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the second of our two main panels and the third of our panels altogether on electronic health record regulation, specifically the development of the 21st Century Cures Act and electronic health records transfer and access. I'll just wait for all our panelists to get on board, but in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and offer introductions as they join us. So first, we have Elise Anthony, who serves as the Executive Director of Policy at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health Information Technology. She leads ONC's engagement in a range of high-priority federal policy efforts, including regulatory development, information blocking, macro implementation, and governance. Prior to this position, she served as the Deputy Director of Policy, where she led the Division of Strategic Policy, the Division of State and Interoperability Policy, and the Division of Federal Policy and Regulatory Affairs. Next, we have Annie Harrington, who is the Chief Legal Officer for the Colorado Regional Health Information Organization, or CORIO. In this role, she ensures CORIO's compliance with healthcare policy regulations, emerging data privacy laws, and other evolving regulatory areas. Prior to joining CORIO, Annie was a principal with Squire Patton Boggs and has expertise in navigating HIPAA, high-tech, and 42 CFR Part 2 compliance. Finally, we have Bill Howard, who is a principal at Audacious Inquiry. He has spent 25 plus years in healthcare IT, focused on many aspects of interoperability, ranging from labs, claims, HIEs, and population health. These positions have offered experience with large and complex health IT technical implementations, and within a range of legal and policy frameworks, both in the US and around the globe. Bill serves on the eHealth Exchange Board and has provided strategic roadmap services to New York's SHIN New York, Sequoia, and SHIEC. I'm looking forward to this panel. A couple of housekeeping notes. A reminder, Congresswoman DeGette cannot join us for the keynote after this, so this will be our last event of the conference. And also, if you're going to ask questions, if you can click on the Q&A chat button at the bottom of your screen, so all your questions will be in one place. I actually request that you ask questions while the panel is ongoing, and that way, if there are a lot of questions, I may stop with my questions a little earlier to get at the audience questions, which are usually far more interesting than my own. We'll go ahead and start with the questions, and I'm going to direct my first question to Elise. Elise, I was wondering if you could provide us with an overview of TEFCA and describe its inception. How did the thinking come to go with a recognized coordinating entity from industry rather than have ONC provide the oversight itself?
Absolutely, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. Good afternoon. All right, so I think the best place to start is to think of the 21st Century Cures Act. So there's a lot of discussion about other parts of the Act today. This section actually is also, or this effort is actually also in the 21st Century Cures Act. And the 21st Century Cures Act calls for network-to-network exchange, enabling, developing or supporting that environment of network-to-network exchange. And that comes after there being some progress in terms of exchange, but also some concern that exchange is not moving as it should, that the progress has not been where it should be. So you can think about situations in which the use cases for moving information might center around treatment, for example. But when it comes to other very important use cases as well, that there really is not the mechanism for that information to move. So I tend to talk a lot with my hands. So I usually describe it as sometimes you see this in terms of information can move pretty seamlessly. But in other situations, that's not always the case. And maybe it's because you don't trust my security protocols, or you don't feel like I'm protecting information as I should. Or that I move information for treatment and you want it for another purpose, so therefore information doesn't flow. So this happens. And information is not getting to where it needs to go to support patients or the providers who serve them. Congress recognized this concern, and then the provision focused on trusted exchange and a common agreement specifically addressed this. And they asked ONC to think about how we can support that environment. And that's where you have this idea of trusted exchange framework as well as the common agreement come into place. And the call for a common agreement is actually called out specifically by Congress in 21st Century Cures Act. So what ONC wanted to do, as is always our practice here at ONC, is to really think about how to hear from stakeholders about what is needed, what is missing, what can be added to this environment to better support that seamless movement of information, how to support things like scalability of a network-to-network exchange environment. We put out, at this point, we've had several comment periods where stakeholders were first able to comment on what they thought we should be considering, what are parts of the framework that would be important, what are parts of the common agreement. Then we released draft 1 and received comment on that. We put together an updated draft and released draft 2, and that's where we are right now. Now, that was a long-winded way of coming back around to your question of thinking about the RCE, which stands for Recognized Coordinating Entity. I will try to avoid too many acronyms here today. But the Recognized Coordinating Entity is a part of our mechanism to support trusted exchange, the network-to-network environment. And Congress calls for us to think about public-private partnerships and how to engage with stakeholders. Our goal through TEFCA altogether is to fill the gaps. Some of those gaps that I talked about that prevent the information from moving where it needs to go, where appropriate. So that's what we did. So in terms of thinking about the gaps, we want to make sure we're engaging with stakeholders. So that's not just through the public comment process, but also in regards to those who have experience in the exchange environment. In identifying the recognized coordinating entity, we went through a competitive process for identifying who would be awarded a cooperative agreement. And that cooperative agreement allows us to work very closely with the entity to structure, to implement, and to advance the use of the common agreement framework. And that includes things like onboarding, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, later on in terms of QHINs, or thinking about participants and participant members. All phrases I'm throwing out, but I promise they will come out as part of the conversation. So in long/short form, our goal has really been to engage with stakeholders, and that's what having an RCE helps us to do. There are oversight mechanisms attached in there. So one, as folks know, we have drafted the minimum required terms and conditions that went out for 2 drafts at this point, and we received comment on it. Those are the minimum items that we think are critical to support the exchange environment. They include legal principles, and that's part of how we want to make sure that the trusted exchange framework environment is coming to fruition as Congress has intended for it to do, as HHS believes it should be implemented. We also have the ability to review, to receive the comment from the RCE and stakeholders, review, and then ultimately release a final common agreement. So there are components in there for us to work with the RCE, but also to make sure that it is moving forward as we believe it should as well.
Thank you so much, and that was an excellent overview. So really appreciate it. And I also should note that ONC, I'm sure with Elise's input, has put out an excellent user guide that is part of the material that actually got circulated. So if you want some more details, that guide provides all the visual diagrams. I don't know if you drew any of them, Elise, but they really are. The diagrams are really great.
It is a team, and we're very devoted to making sure that we put out materials that can help folks to easily see what we're trying to do, because I think that also helps in terms of folks in the very busy lives that we all lead, being able to identify where is of most interest to them for purposes of commenting and engaging with us along the way. And I'm happy to type in the chat or send along the web address for that, but it's healthit.gov/TEFCA, and that will take you to the full page of all of the resources.
Absolutely, and that actually was circulated to all the registrants. Awesome. So yes, they have access to that. So Bill, my next question is for you, and I was wondering what some of the implementation issues are that you foresee with TEFCA as it currently stands.
Yeah.
So I'll let you jump ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Sounds good. And Elise, thanks for the intro there on TEFCA in a couple of minutes. That was a nice summary. I think from an implementation perspective, I mean, you got to think about the environment this is going into, where you've got, many different entities that are exchanging information around the country. And, a lot of the exchange is, of course, based on trust. And the way that a lot of the trust was built over the years was by kind of constraining down the participants that could be engaged in exchange, by constraining down the permitted purposes, maybe just treatment as opposed to treatment, payment, and operations. And so with the new framework, TEFCA framework, and as part of becoming a QHIN, a lot of that needs to be sort of expanded. I mean, the permitted purposes are expanded quite a bit to what people are used to, and the participants are also expanded quite a bit. And so what that usually entails then is actually saying, okay, if I'm, let's say, operating a health exchange, and let's say I have a few thousand participants, these are different hospitals or different provider groups that have all signed agreements saying, yeah, no, I'm comfortable exchanging data that way. A lot of that needs to get revisited via updating participation agreements or updating policies and things like that. So in the one hand, it's great because it's going to create sort of a level playing field, and as Elise kind of showed, the different plugs and sockets will be able to plug in nicely. The challenge will be to kind of get from here to there in terms of just the practicality of updating participation agreements and policies and this stuff that seems like it would be really easy to do, but it actually can be fairly tricky to actually go and implement. And so I think, and the other big part of it is, in all honesty, is that, it's all around priorities, right? And, I think all of us had all of our priorities shook up about a month ago, 3 weeks ago. And when we think about, where to prioritize TEFCA and whether to become a QHIN, it all comes down to, putting focus on it amongst other competing priorities. And so one of the other challenges to implement this, in my opinion, is that right now it's hard to see exactly what carrots and sticks are going to require this to get prioritized at the right level. And with COVID being a perfect example, where it all of a sudden now everything gets put to the top, but there were other final rules that dropped, on the 9th of March, for example, from CMS related to other conditions of participation. And so one of the other implementation challenges becomes, how do you prioritize this, and what are the incentives to become a QHIN, or is it worth the financial risk to do this? And so those are some of the other challenges, from an implementation perspective. And I'm thinking about it more from a, across the country, working with many health exchanges. And maybe Annie, you can comment on a specific health exchange and bring it down to reality in Colorado.
Sure, would be delighted to, and I can't tell you how great it is to talk about something other than COVID-19. So I'm thrilled to be talking about business as usual topics like TEFCA. Thanks for having me, Craig. Sure. So we've spent a fair amount of time on my team at Correo talking about what the implications of TEFCA will be for health information exchanges like mine. We currently have a network that there's 7.3 million unique individuals in our that's whose information flows through our HIE in Colorado. We have 73 hospitals, 66 of whom are sending us data. We have 6,600 providers that log into our system. So the burden of ultimately having to amend thousands of or hundreds or thousands of participation agreements in order to bring ourselves into compliance with whatever the flow down requirements come out to be in the TEFCA network of networks, I think is a real consideration for entities like mine who are considering where they fit in the TEFCA ecosystem. But I also think stepping back from that consideration and looking at the voluntary nature of TEFCA, and Bill alluded to the carrots and sticks piece, but I think it's really critical. And I think that the concept of how are you going to incentivize participation when everybody wants to say that they are promoting interoperability and wants to be able to, particularly in the context that we're in right now, be able to share data when and where data is needed at the national level if necessary. How do you balance that against the business realities that there's nothing in particular that we've seen to date that would incentivize individuals to build the infrastructure that would be required to participate? I think that's a serious consideration, and one that that at least the high TAC committee that was convened and sent a bunch of recommendations to you all pending the conclusion of the round 2 of TEFCA comments. I think they really focused on this and pointed it out and asked the ONC to think about how are you going to make participation? How are you going to incentivize participation? And is it going to be through carrots, like we saw in the High Tech Act, where there was meaningful use dollars that were spent to try to incentivize and entice folks to participate? Or is it going to be more of a, you're required to do it if you want to engage with federal agencies like VA and CMS that many organizations like mine want to participate with? So I would love to hear, Elise, if you have any thoughts on what are the incentives and how are you going to make sure that a voluntary, quote unquote, voluntary program gets some airtime. And Craig, I see that you're breaking it, or you're cutting it. Sorry.
And I wanted to, I also just wanted to add to that because, and just one point, just to make clear to all participants that, so TEFCA is completely voluntary, right? So the goal is to create a national health information network, but the problem that Bill and Annie are referring to is the fact that it is voluntary, and you've got to do all of this legwork to actually, get onto it, renegotiating agreements and things like that. A little bit of background. So in the draft rule that was discussed in the previous panel, there was the safe harbor provision. The idea was, right, there was the proposal that we would exempt individuals or limit them somehow from information blocking claims if they joined TEFCA. And I thought to myself when I read that, I thought, okay, well, this is great, but actually we definitely need more, right? And I've written a couple of pieces on what some additional carrots and sticks might be. But in the final rule, we actually don't even have that. And so I was kind of curious as to the background conversations, because I know that there was just so much commentary on this. And so I'm really curious to hear the story behind it.
Sure. You're touching on another component that's in my portfolio, which is the rule that we posted on our website. So in the rule, in the proposed stage, you're right, and you went exactly where I was going to go, Craig. In the proposed rule, we included a request for comment about how TEFCA could be incorporated into the landscape of what the rule was. We received some great comments on that, and I will say we received over 2,000 comment submissions on the rule itself. And I always say we read every one, and in the rule we address, so when some folks talk about the length of the final rule, part of that is because we spend a lot of time making sure we are responding back to the comments we receive so folks can see what our thinking is. And this is a good point for me to jump to where we are in the TEFCA process. So what we include in the rule, those comments were very helpful, and we will continue to have those for consideration. At this point right now, we're still in the development of the comment agreement stage. So let me back up to the format of what the TEFCA landscape looks like. We talked about the RCE, which we often refer to as the umbrella organization, under which the QHINs would sit, so the Qualified Health Information Networks. And there are certain requirements that would be in place for a HIN, a health information network, to become a QHIN. It depends on where entities want to exist in the TEFCA landscape. One of the things we've been really careful about doing, and Dr. Rucker in particular has been very careful about thinking about designing a landscape where entities can exist at different levels. So, and an entity may decide to be a participant member, they may decide to be a participant, they may decide to operate as a HIN, they may decide to operate as a QHIN. And that allows for there to be different opportunities for engagement based upon where that entity, that maybe hospital system, that HIE serves their environment that they serve. And the HIEs in particular are well suited from their background, their experience, what they currently do to participate in the TEFCA landscape. And it's something that we are hoping that we see a lot of. I think the other thing I would say in terms of the participation aspect, we totally agree that this is an environment where for TEFCA to be successful, there does have to be engagement from different entities. QHINs who are coming to the table saying, I want to be a QHIN. HINs who are wanting to participate underneath the QHIN for that purpose. And how that evolves, we want to allow enough space for that to happen in an innovative way, because there are different use cases that may apply as well. But we also recognize that currently the way the landscape works, the network to network movement of information is not scalable in many ways. And we want to support the scalability of that while also supporting the successes that have already occurred, whether it's HIEs or other mechanisms in which information is moving. We want to support that environment. So the landscape we've created, and in the user's guide that we sent is what we call the umbrella side, affectionately here at ONC, and that shows the layout. And you can see that there's different places where entities can participate. To go to your question about, to back up in terms of where we are in the process now. So we released draft 2 in the spring, and now we are at the stage of working with the recognized coordinating entity. The recognized coordinating entity's COIA project actually has a work group that they are setting up for the purposes of receiving this type of feedback. Feedback in terms of how it is laid out, whether it's from the incentive perspective or whether it's from the legal requirements or the technical requirements, all of that could be provided to the RCE as part of their process. And once we have what their thoughts are on what we call the minimum required terms and conditions, the MRTCs, as well as the additional required terms and conditions, that will come together to create a draft common agreement. And we look forward to putting that out for comment as well. So in terms of how this is going to operate and in terms of are we striking the right balance in terms of incentives or not, we look forward to hearing those comments because it's important for us to get this right. And that's why we have different stages in the process, the evolution that's been very open for folks to see in terms of, for example, draft 1 to draft 2 to what will ultimately be in the common agreement pending what we see from the RCE. I hope that answers a little bit of the question. You're on mute, Craig.
Okay, sorry, I'm still learning the keyboard shortcuts and I hit the wrong shortcut. And I also just wanted to as we talk about umbrella concepts, that I believe is from correct me if I'm wrong, Elise, but from the user guide, the TEFCA user guide.
Yes,
and that sort of shows the umbrella organization, RCE at the top, that has agreements with sort of sub-entities known as QHINs, that's Qualified Health Information Networks, that then have participants linked up with them, and you have participants of various different kinds, from covered entities to non-covered entities, etc., all playing in the same space. So I just thought that might be an interesting overview for people to rely on. I'll stop the share in a second, because you can find that in the material that was circulated to all registrants. But I just wanted to show that to you, since I thought that might be easier than our panelists trying to do the diagrams with their hands. but that's great. Thank you. So as I said, you've got different kinds of participants participating, and some of them are covered, some of them are not, and so we have this interesting situation where different entities are subject to different privacy rules, and TEFCA itself will engage with privacy protections in different ways. So I was wondering, Annie, what you might think about the additional privacy protections you might see that are required, the thoughts about privacy protections that already exist in TEFCA, and the variety of non-covered and covered entities that we want.
Yes, thank you for asking. The privacy nerd in me is always thrilled to talk about questions like this. So, wisely, very wisely, and perhaps unavoidably, what the drafters at ONC and Elise's office, and after several iterations of comments, they've made the wise choice to, and by understanding that in order to give comfort to all individuals, all types of entities that are participating in this so-called national infrastructure or network of networks, you have to set a very, very robust baseline of privacy and security protections. And you have to ensure that all participants and players are held to this same robust baseline of privacy and data security requirements. And so, the concept is actually quite familiar for those of us that have operated. Bill works a lot with HIEs, has worked with Shiny, has worked with Chic, which is our trade organization. HIEs were built upon the foundation of privacy law and rely on the so-called trust community. And sometimes I roll at that moniker, but it really underscores the importance of reliability, confidence, truth, and consistency in how data is exchanged. And so the realization and recognition that in order to establish a baseline, you in this context will have to do it contractually through the common agreement. I think that was a smart decision, and one that we've seen done successfully in other network exchanges like the DURSA that the eHealth Exchange administers. What I think we'll see in the next, or I hope we'll see, as the common agreement becomes more fully baked, so to speak, and as the additional required terms and conditions are drafted by the Sequoia Group with all of its stakeholder input, and as the minimum MRTCs are modified in the final version of the next version of the common agreement, what I hope we'll see is a little bit more explanation for users, for tech companies, app developers who are not used to participating potentially in the HIPAA environment. I hope we'll get some more clarity around what are the baseline requirements that are in line and aligned with HIPAA, and then what are we building on in this next draft of the common agreement. In other words, which ones go above the HIPAA baseline that all of us who are traditional HIPAA covered entities and business associates are very accustomed to using. So I think the best example of that is in the meaningful choice space, which does differ and goes beyond, the HIPAA doesn't have really any consent requirements, so to speak, when it comes to how your PHI can be exchanged electronically. And so we're seeing that definition come out in the common agreement, which is great, but it's new. And so some more guidance, I think, will be forthcoming, and more detail, of course, will be forthcoming. And we can talk about the preemption issues, Craig, with the meaningful choice issue later on in the draft. But I think that the baseline and helping people understand when they're to comply with HIPAA from a breach notification perspective, from an accounting and disclosures perspective, and when we're outside of HIPAA and squarely in TEFCA, will be very important.
You're on mute, Craig.
I know. I keep trying to use these keyboard shortcuts, but they are not working. But so I guess quick follow up, which is so off your last sentence, people complain about HIPAA complexity now, and so I was wondering what your thoughts would be when they've got to comply with sort of two sets of regulations as they may see it layered upon each other. What are your? I'm just going to leave you to talk about your thoughts with respect to that, difficulties, pluses, minuses, etc.
Yeah, so I think that's where the RCE's role and ONC's role on education will be critical to helping people understand exactly what does compliance look like in a network of networked environments. What do traditional tech companies have to do in order to ensure that they're meeting these baseline requirements? And it's also where I think governance is going to come significantly into play. Part of how HIEs have been successful and other networks that are already doing this on a smaller scale have been successful is because we've established trust in part through the way that we're governed by, we have very robust contracts, but underlying those contracts, we have layers of policies and procedures, and we have committees who vet when we have a new permissible use category or a new use case that comes into play. And so those are vetted by our stakeholders communities before they're rolled out. And so I think that the governance piece of TEFCA, and I know that Marianne Yeager and her team are deeply enmeshed at the moment in trying to parse out what that will look like in a networked environment like TEFCA, I think will be critical. Craig, I think this is the place where you want me to shift to the preemption questions, because I think that they are significant, but I'm seeing you.
Yeah, we'll pause on that for a second, because we are going to, and I feel the preemption issues are bigger than just the privacy issues.
Yeah.
So before we get there, I actually have a question for both Elise and Bill, and really, I'll start with Elise, and then we can and then Bill. So do you think there'll be a role for existing networks and entities like Care Quality, Apple, even Google in TEFCA, and who do you predict, to the extent you feel like you can speak to those predictions, who do you predict the big players will be in this space? And so Elise, we'll start with
1, 2, 3, not it. Elise, you want to start, and I'll go next?
I will say I will leave the predictions to others. I will say that the landscape, that our hope is that you will see a environment where the successes of what has happened already in terms of exchange continue. Again, the goal of TEFCA is to address the gaps in my favorite word when it comes to TEFCA is landscape, right? Landscape and ecosystem, because that's really the environment that we want to support. We want to support an ecosystem, a landscape where the gaps have been filled in, so health information can move where it needs to go, right? To support the patient, to support the provider, that it's scalable. Those are kind of some of the considerations we have. So as part of that, our goal is to do exactly that through supporting those health HINs, I'll say, HINs or other entities, participant members who are already moving information. So our goal is not to do anything, oops, sorry. I think I muted myself for a second, sorry. Our goal is to support the movement of information, but only addressing the gaps, where we see the gaps or where we see there's a problem. And those problems have been identified to us as well as Congress, in terms of where things are not moving as they should, or there's some issue that's preventing that flow of information when it would otherwise appropriately move. So we think that the environment we've set up allows that to happen. I think some folks will come in as QHINs, and there's certain requirements that we put into place for a QHIN to be able to participate, and that's in the user's guide as well. But it's important because the function of a QHIN is to kind of support that actual movement across the networks, between networks. Others may decide that HIN is more the level that they think works for them to support the movement of information. I think the other thing to think about is the landscape that we're supporting, there's that word again, that landscape that we're supporting thinks about a broader set of exchange purposes and in some cases currently already moving. For example, we see treatment, but we also include other exchange purposes as well. And I think that's important for supporting the overall landscape. Some of the ones that we think about or that we included are treatment, some components of operations. We include benefits determination, which is something that has been raised to us several times from folks like Social Security Administration. So we think about not just the private sector, but also our federal partners in terms of supporting that environment that is necessary for the movement of information generally. So I don't think I have any predictions per se in terms of the entities, but I will note that the definition of QHIN that we include is a functional definition, and that's purposeful. And that's something that we strongly believe in. It's not the title of the entity per se, it's what they are able to do.
Thank you so much, Elise. Bill.
Oh, it sounds like I get to do the predicting then. Well, so I'll take at least a somewhat of a pragmatic shot at it. I mean, I think if you go back to the picture, the umbrella picture for a minute, and start at the top. I mean, the RCE was designated last fall, so that makes that decision and prognostication not necessary. But so the Sequoia project is the RCE, and then if you go the next layer down to the QHIN layer. And you just think about, a network of networks and how many of these things could you have? I mean, if there's 100 QHINs, it's probably too many, and but maybe you want to be down in the small tens or 3 or 5 or 10 of these things, and you can start to kind of list off, who they could possibly be, just looking at what's out there today. If you start with the most obvious ones, because they've even said that they will do this. Organizations like eHealth Exchange, they've been doing this type of work for more than a decade. They have participants that are, push-pulling and soon to be probably alerting on data, so they can fulfill the different ways the data flow. And while there's definitely gaps, they all have gaps. I think eHealth Exchange certainly is an organization that could stand up to be a QHIN, and they have the sustainability, and it kind of makes sense. Commonwealth is in the same category, I would think. They've got all the different ways to exchange the data. They've been doing this work, and they have members that are signed up, and they have the sustainability model, and so that's kind of an obvious one. A lot of times people think of Care Quality as another network. Well, it's actually not a network. It's more of a framework for exchange of data. So with Care Quality, you have to kind of take a look at who are the implementers of the Care Quality framework that could possibly be a QHIN. And if you could look at the list of logos, and you could say, well, oh, that's interesting. SureScripts has some of the attributes, and so maybe someone like them could become a QHIN. And then you start to look around the landscape, and I use the word there, Elise, and you say, well, okay, where else are the data today? And you look at someone like an organization like Epic, and now they're kind of interesting because half of their members, half of the organizations that use Epic in their health systems are already participants of eHealth Exchange. The other half are participants of Care Quality. And you could picture, well, maybe Epic would do something on their own, or maybe they would just rely on one of those other options. If you look at Cerner, for example, Cerner has a long history with Commonwealth. And so you could picture a lot of those organizations would become Commonwealth members, perhaps, or a lot of them have not to date after all these years. And so maybe they would take a different approach. And then lastly, or a couple more examples just to throw out there to get people thinking about it and what the environment could look like down the road, is you have all the existing health exchanges in the country. There's probably on the order of 100, of which maybe 80 of them are part of a trade organization called Chic. And you could picture Chic has what they call a patient-centered data home, which is a exchange approach where it's more of a push-based approach. But that's one of the modalities of what a QHIN is supposed to do, and they do some queries within PCDH as well. And so you could picture either all the health exchanges together, banding together, or maybe a chunk of them that could become and provide QHIN services. And so I don't know, you can start to pretty quickly come up with more than, one or two or three of these QHINs. You could probably see, probably more than was desired, actually. I can only imagine what the whiteboards looked like at ONC over the last number of years, but I could picture, I don't think there'll be a shortage of organizations that are signed up to be QHINs. I think the question is, which are the ones that make the most sense from a sustainability perspective, and especially for a long-term, sustainability.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Bill. And Annie, actually, before I turn to you, Annie, I just want to remind the audience to go ahead and ask question and answers, because we'll turn to Q&As in a second. So Annie, I was actually going to ask you a question to follow up on Bill's, but just because I'm hoping some Q&As will pop up, I'm going to turn to the last major question that I had, which is something you referred to earlier, which is the issue of preemption. There are all kinds of state laws that have relevance here, right? We've got state laws that require entities to be part of the state HIE or to comply with state privacy laws with respect to health networks. And as we saw in the comments to, I have to admit, I've not finished reading all the comments to TEFCA Draft 2, but I did read all the comments to TEFCA Draft 1. And there were many entities that raised concerns about with these different of state laws, HIPAA, TEFCA rules, etc. So as of now, TEFCA says you've got to comply with all applicable law, which it defines as including state law. How do you think that's all going to play together and come together? Just lay out the landscape for us.
Sure. Sure. And I referred to it earlier, but I'll say it again. We refer to the concept of meaningful choice. It's colloquially referred to amongst HIEs as sort of the opt-in or opt-out model of how states have handled a patient's ability to consent or not consent to participate in electronic exchange of information. I think that provides a good window into the type of confusion and patchwork issue that you're alluding to, Craig, that I think is really apropos. I recently did a presentation and collected current data on consent, and as of September 2016, which is the most recent date that I could find up-to-date information, we have 9 states in the US that have an opt-in policy, meaning that patients have to affirmatively agree that they agree to have their information exchanged electronically through HIEs. 36 states had opt-out policies, and that includes Colorado. Ours is not statutory, but it is a consensus-driven policy that we've implemented with our other HIE on the Western Slope, who we work closely with, who you just heard from earlier, the CTO, Mark Rousseau. We have an opt-out model here in Colorado, along with 35 other states, and then there are the remaining states, and just including DC, have a hybrid model. Or rules are pending, right? And so there's a big difference, right, on how states handle the concept of meaningful choice, of giving patients choice on having their information exchanged. And the TEFCA draft 2, I'm getting all my acronyms mixed up. QHIN draft, the TEFCA draft 2 refers to this concept of meaningful choice and suggests that a QHIN is going to have to just comply with all of the different meaningful choice provisions that may be in place in the various states in which it covers. So I guess you'd have a situation whereby Epic would have to put a notice up, if it decided to be a QHIN, would have to put a notice up on its website that said, if you're a state, and it would probably be based on domicile, right, of the patient, you have to comply with this, this, and this. And once you've shown us that you have complied with the state-specific requirement, then you can exchange data through the TEFCA network accordingly. Because we don't have any sort of uniform technology to help us assist with consent from a technology perspective, and because we certainly don't have any uniform practice of how consent is managed at the state level, that could be really tricky for QHINs. Craig, you recently published a law review article, and I don't know if it was included with the information that was distributed to all participants here, but you allude to the concept of why not ensure that TEFCA preempts all state laws, but make sure you do it narrowly, right? Because there are really important elements of having states have specific privacy protections that are driven by a stakeholder consensus and that take into account the unique circumstances within each state. Obviously very important, but for those entities that choose to participate in the TEFCA concept, why not preempt state laws to the extent that those state laws might bump up against the information that's flowing through the network. I think there's legs there. I think that is you can make a very compelling case that would perhaps incentivize compliance officers and other companies, individuals or entities that are struggling with whether or not this makes sense to participate. That might help them get over the participation hump to work and to participate in TEFCA. But I will say, I think there's significant hurdles to putting that in place, and I'll use the most recent draft privacy bill that the Energy and Commerce Committee put out this year that we went to Washington to talk to them about, and there's just giant gaps in the bill itself that they put out for public comments on the preemption issue, because even staffers on those key committees just can't agree on what is the best approach in that case. So of course that bill was intended to apply to consumer protections and not HIPAA covered entities, but still, nevertheless, the analogy stands that is the proverbial hot potato, preemption and private right of action in privacy speak from a policy perspective. And so figuring out how to do that in the TEFCA context is going to be a challenge. I don't know if Elise has any thoughts on the preemption piece. It's pretty far in the weeds for lawyers, but.
And I'm actually, I was going to ask Elise for her thoughts. So you're absolutely right. There is this piece that I wrote on that front, and that's the piece I referred to, where I said, look, what's the carrot to join TEFCA? Well, at the time when I wrote it, we only had the draft version of the information blocking rule, and I said, well, why don't we just add a carrot that would, in addition to allowing individuals to be exempt from the information blocking rule, the additional carrot would be that they would be able to be exempt from state laws as that state law applied to the exchange of information on the health information, on TEFCA, right? So, but if they left, if there were any data issues outside the TEFCA framework, they would still be subject to state law, and that could be an additional carrot to have entities join TEFCA. And I did circulate a part of the article. to the registrants, but not the part where I make the argument. I just circulated the part where, to provide the overview. My students complain I assign too much reading. I didn't want to make the same mistake here. Going with respect to, how can we support implementation of state laws as well as federal law? Do we want to do that? Doesn't that to some degree go against Congress's intent in trying to create this national health information network in 21st century cures when we try and comply with all of these nitty-gritty regulations of states and sometimes even municipalities?
Just as a reminder of where we are in the process, right? So we're in the middle of the process, and you're right. In draft 2, we do start with applicable law. So applicable law, there's not a preemption provision in there. We provide for the recognizing of applicable law, then the common agreement provisions, which, as we noted already, are legal in many respects, and that's the minimum required terms and conditions and the additional required terms and conditions. And then participant agreements and so forth. I think it's important to know that these are the types of things that we're looking forward to receiving engagement from as the RCE works through and helps us to refine the MRTCs and helps to develop the ARCCs, the additional required terms and conditions. Trying to stay away from acronyms, bear with me, everyone. So these are the types of things that we do want feedback from. Also, we work very closely with OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, and you had Ileana on, former colleague, as well as Lucia Savage, who was our Chief Privacy Officer when she was here. So hello to my colleagues from another panel, former colleagues from another panel, I guess I should say now. But these are the types of things that we work across with our federal partners on thinking through to make sure that what we put together in TEFCA in its final form, in the common agreement in its final form, can be effective, and that we are very conscious about how we are working with different laws, whether they are other federal laws or state laws. So in that respect, I think it's one of the issues that, we look forward to hearing more on. And from there, we will not only just work on those within ONC, but also with our partners, such as the Office of Civil Rights and others, as we think through how this plays out and how the laws work together towards the final.
Thank you very much for that, Elise. Really appreciate that. And it's so exciting to be able to talk about this in the middle of the process in some ways, and and get a preview of how things will unfold. We don't have questions in the audience panel, so I'm just going to continue with my questions, if that's okay with you guys. And so
no problem there.
Thank you. So my next question actually is to Annie. Since Annie, this follows up on the points Bill made earlier about existing players. So Correo is very much an existing player. It is the HIE of Colorado, and so I'm curious about, in addition to the conversations you're having about participation agreements and things like that, what are some of the other things that, at least that you can disclose? Where does Correo see itself as participating in
Sure.
Are there plans to maybe be a QN? Are there plans to do something else? Where do you see yourselves fitting in this landscape? Sorry, everyone's going to use the word that.
No, thanks for the question. And I'll just say that we have had multiple, there is another HIE in Colorado that covers the Western Slope that we work very closely with. And so a lot of our conversations have involved how does Colorado as the net of both of us, where do we see ourselves? I think that part of our struggle has been, we've been thinking about this a lot as a team, where do we see ourselves in the TEFCA ecosystem? And I know that I can expand that and say that many HIEs across the country, including some of the ones that Bill has worked with, and I know Elise heard and read comments from HIEs across the country who are very, very closely looking at this and trying to consider where do we fit in this ecosystem. And so I'll have a couple of comments. The first is that we've made the case both to our congressional members of Congress and also directly to the ONC in the form of comments that we feel strongly and are very glad to see an effort to build upon existing infrastructure that by itself was put in place with significant amounts of taxpayer dollars to stand out the HIEs and at the regional and state level. And so the idea that we would rip and replace anything like that in favor, anything that we would rip and replace instead of building upon the existing infrastructure. We're very supportive of the latter, obviously. And I think, in terms of how we've seen it, we touched on it at the very beginning of this panel, and I think it bears mentioning again, that so much of this is in flux still. It's hard to know and make really any business predictions as to where HIEs fit in the QHIN RCE underneath the RCE. But the lack of clear financial incentives, so to speak, what it would mean for us to have to build the infrastructure versus what would the benefits we would reap be, I think are really where you're going to see a lot of the analysis happen in boardrooms across the country with HIEs. And to your point about preemption, I think the preemption question is certainly one that may tip the scales one way or another from a compliance perspective, but I really think it's the business questions. What is the business impetus for entities like mine? Those will be the ones that ultimately decide on whether an organization can and chooses to participate in TEFCA. And Bill, I don't know if you have anything to add based on your experience advising clients like mine.
Yeah, well, I mean, the one thing that's interesting, and Elise, you can keep me honest here, but a lot of the concept of TEFCA and QHINs and RCE and all that, it's been a few years, right? I mean, the concept of building a network of networks and kind of using a framework and a technical approach that's kind of the minimum bar to make sure that everyone can use it. I mean, it's been out there, and what's interesting is that as other investment or focus areas come up, obviously QHIN, becoming a QHIN is super important, but when you start to think about from a product strategy perspective and you start to think about from a business perspective, what the world looks like today compared to when the whole QHIN concept started a couple of years ago is different. And even, I would say, compared to 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, things are different. Want to spend our rare and difficult to spend cycles on something that is going to support maybe telehealth, something brand new that's grown in the last 2 weeks, like crazy, or more around biosurveillance, things like that. To me, those are areas where I think we're going to see a ton of activity, especially with the CARES Act funding and with focus, like happens every time we have one of these crises. You're going to see, I think, a total shift, a jump shift in where some activity is, and a lot of developments being happening or focused over the next couple, I would say 3, 6, 9 months because of COVID. And so I think, it'll be interesting to see where things start to focus given some of these most recent things that have popped up as a result of the pandemic, and also where that money is going to flow will be a way to direct a lot of development where people are going to be focusing.
And actually, that's a great segue to my question for Elise, which is I'm curious about whether the events of the last month have affected conversations. I mean, obviously, people at CDC are talking about these things, right? But I'm curious as to whether it's affecting conversations within ONC, both with respect to TEFCA, but because your portfolio really just includes everything interesting at ONC, also with respect to the final rule of the information blocking.
So I don't know if my portfolio includes everything interesting. We have some great teams at ONC, and quite frankly, we work so well together to make sure we hit the right balance. Like, there's no rulemaking meeting or TEFCA engagement where we don't have the tech teams, the clinical team, all working together. So across the landscape. But I think when it comes to, well, let me answer in 2 ways. First, let me start with the broader question that you asked, which is around thinking about COVID-19. What our goal has been is to be supportive of our federal partners who are on the ground, who are working very closely on a lot of these issues. We work closely with CDC and others. Excuse me. And in fact, there's a couple of things that we're doing to be supportive and support the information being available about what's happening around health IT and addressing and providing for the COVID-19 response. One is what we call the Interoperability Proving Ground, and it's available on our website. So if you just search Interoperability Proving Ground, or for those who love acronyms, IPG, the IPG is a place that we've set up. We've had it before, but we've utilized COVID-19 for entities wherever you are to identify what you are doing to support COVID-19 response in terms of health information technology, the flow of information across electronic systems, et cetera. So that's available. There's a number of projects already listed in there. You can actually search by keywords and things like that. We hope that supports the flow of information and creative thinking and collaboration. So I encourage folks to check that out as well. Also, and this was mentioned earlier, the Health Information Technology Advisory Committee is an advisory committee to ONC. They had a meeting a week ago now or so, focused on COVID-19 and thinking about areas where their input could be helpful to that conversation. So that's something that's ongoing, and we've been working with the co-chairs and with the members for that. So more to come on that effort. In terms of TEFCA overall, when we think of TEFCA, we try to think of the floor that will support that network-to-network exchange that Congress has asked us to enable. And that's an important point because in doing that, it allows for innovation and adjustment over time. Having a broader set of exchange purposes beyond just treatment is also important for that same purpose. So when things arise, situations arise in which health IT systems need to be able to adjust to new scenarios or the need for information to move in certain ways, we want a TEFCA environment that is able to do that. There was another point raised earlier that I also want to touch on in terms of engagement with HIEs, for example, that perspective is really important. And it's important to what we are thinking about in terms of TEFCA. So for example, under the TEFCA landscape, you would have situations where we've heard a lot about hospitals currently that might have 5 or so different network modalities that they have to support and pay for to move information. With TEFCA, some of that would decrease. At the same time, HIEs, for example, that to provide not only exchange purposes, but they also may do other projects to support the providers that they serve, they would have more information available to them, appropriately available to them, of course, as with anything under TEFCA, but it would have more information available to them so they can provide some of those other scenarios. We've heard about HIEs providing analytic services or other kind of services that benefit the provider and help them see information in ways that work for them to support their care continuum that they're treating or caring for, and that's the environment we want to continue to support. So not just thinking about the patients and the providers, which is obviously paramount, but also thinking about the landscape that is currently moving information as well. I think I answered a couple of questions in there, but tell me if I didn't.
No, that was super helpful. That was super helpful. So we have 2 minutes left, and I have one more question. So why not? Which actually flowed from something you said. And so I just really enjoyed reading the second draft of TEFCA and looking at how you adjusted, based on the various comments. One thing I noticed, one use case that wasn't discussed was that of research. And I was curious about, as you say, we're in the middle of the process. Are there conversations about maybe in draft 3 or draft 8, I don't know, of increasing, of maybe having research purposes, especially in the light of COVID-19 and other crises that may hit the country? And we might go over by a couple of minutes, but I'll start with you, Elise, and then I'll move to Bill and Annie.
Absolutely. So you're right. Research is not included as an exchange purpose that's under TEFCA. We do look forward to seeing what comes out of the RCE. If that's a suggestion that they make, we are always open to considering new things. It's important to us that we remain open throughout this process, similar to how we do any other policy at ONC, where we put out what our thinking is, and then we receive comment from stakeholders on whether this is hitting the right notes for them and the patients and the use cases that they serve. And then from there, we make adjustments if we need to, or sometimes we do say, no, we think we have the right balance here, or no, we were a little bit off and we're going to adjust in this way. So right now it's not included at this time. If we see what stakeholders say as part of the process as we go forward, or what the RCE comes back with as well. And then at that point, like any other provision that's in there or any other comments we receive, we'll decide whether the adjustments would need to be made.
Absolutely, thank you. Bill, I was wondering if you might have anything to add to that. Oh, I don't know if we still have Bill, because, Bill, are you still there? Because you're frozen on my screen. I think we may have lost Bill. So I will turn to Annie if you have anything.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I'll just close by saying, research is not a space yet that we have ventured into as an HIE in Colorado, nor has our sister HIE QHN, but ultimately, we were stood up as nonprofit organizations to serve our provider and clinical communities and to meet needs that they have when it comes to information. And so the question of our research use case is certainly one that we've talked about, and the current circumstances that we find ourselves in, I think are apropos. We're 100% focused on helping our clinical communities respond to the COVID crisis and get the information that they need in order to serve and meet and treat patients on the front lines. And so in the event that we had a research use case brought to us by our participants, we would certainly consider it and talk about what legal and other privacy protection mechanisms were needed to cover any gaps in our existing policies. And I suspect that very much the same would be the case for the TEFCA network and the common agreement once it gets fully vetted and worked out, that there will be future, and I know that there are allowances for future additions, future new permissible uses, when the communities that are using this information call for them. And so I suspect that is a place that we will see evolution going forward.
It's wonderful. Annie, Elise, and Bill, I don't know if you can hear me, but thanks to all of you. This was truly a fantastic conversation. And I know that for a couple of our audience members, I got some comments asking for additional sources, and I just sent them web links because I think that, this is something that everyone is learning about. Elise, I've got to thank you particularly for jumping in at the last minute. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
And Annie and Bill, this was truly incredible. So with that, I will call this panel and the conference to a close, because for those of you who might be just joining us, unfortunately, Representative DeGette cannot join us today. I do want to end with a few thank yous to everyone, because this panel, this conference was truly wonderful and required a great deal of flexibility from everyone, from the folks who helped to organize it, to the panelists who had to jump on for technical checks and things like that, and to audience members who I know had to participate in a very different format in this effort. So I particularly want to give my thanks to Amy Stepanovich, who is the new executive director of the Silicon Flatiron Center. I actually considered canceling the conference altogether because I was a little intimidated by this new and brave world of online conferencing. I'm not one of the brave millennials, and Amy very much pushed and suggested that we can do this, and I'm so glad we went forward. I want to thank Nate Mariotti, our COO at the center, Vanessa Koppel, Heather Martin, Sarah Schnittgrud, and our fantastic IT department that has provided excellent support throughout. I also want to thank our friends from Polsinelli who helped us pull this together as well. So Bruce Johnson, Eliana Peters, and Liz Harding were instrumental in helping us bring on panelists and thinking through this conference. And again, I want to thank all the speakers who have participated in this fairly unorthodox format. I want to thank my faculty colleagues at the Silicon Flatiron Center who have been so supportive of the new initiative, and our fantastic advisory board and supporters of the center. I want to thank the students who have helped the center move forward, and finally to the audience members who have asked some fantastic questions. I've actually, we have a record of the questions, and I'm actually going to go through the questions and make sure I can answer at least some of them to ensure that I at least know how this landscape landscape evolves. We are at a very, very interesting time in the development of health data regulation, both when it comes to data blocking, the data blocking rule, whose enforcement it will be carrying on for over a period of 2, 3, maybe 4 years. So we're still at the beginning of the process in many ways, and of the building of this National Health Information Network, which, as Ms. Anthony talked about, we're still in the middle of. So it'll be exciting to see how this area evolves, and look forward to more events from the Health Data and Regulatory Initiative of the Silicon Flatiron Center as this moves on. Thank you for joining us. Have a good day. Bye-bye.